On this edition of Independent Sources, a special look at poverty, the debate over the numbers, why millions still languish despite reports that poverty is down, and the Brooklyn Borough President talks about wealth disparity in the County of Kings and how he wants to address it.
Independent Sources, your window to the city's ethnic and immigrant communities. Here's your host, Garry Pierre-Pierre.
Brooklyn's been glamorized as a borough that's hip, got heart, and can sometimes get hectic. That fame has brought economic growth to some in the County of Kings, but has left others to languish. I went to Borough Hall to speak to Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams about a wide range of issues, from what he's doing to bridge the poverty gap in Brooklyn to why the presidential candidates are not really talking about the issue.
It is so important that as a borough evolves and grows and becomes this hip and cool place based on its popularity, that popularity must translate into prosperity for all Brooklynites. We are not happy that in certain parts of the borough we have double-digit unemployment. The last census figures show that 25% of the borough lives in poverty. Issues around violence and barriers to middle class. And I have dedicated my time here in Borough Hall to focus on those areas.
Let's talk about employment. What is your office doing to create employment opportunities for those who are unemployed?
Outside of the norm of job fairs, we want to dig into the crevices and really identify why are people unemployed and why are they habitually unemployed, particularly that group of men from 18 to 24 that makes up almost 250,000 people. And how do we focus on them? How do we give them training? How do we ensure that as the new developments take place in Brooklyn, that they're part of the local hiring, that we can hire locally? And then even teach people what it is to hold a job. You know, often that is not part of the conversation, but there are a large segment of the borough, particularly in the crevices where employment needle is not moving. Many of them have never seen the symbol of what permanent employment is. And we want to do that on the ground. Unafraid, unabashed, visiting people on the ground, having local roundtables and conversations, and hiring methods to tell people how to start the process of being part of the employment apparatus.
Do you have programs where you give tax breaks or incentive to corporations, to businesses to move in the borough, particularly in these areas where the unemployment rate is the highest?
I think that we should allow new businesses that move into areas that have three indicators. They should get tax incentives for a particular period of time. Indicators such as high dropout rate, crime rate, and unemployment rate. If you're a business that's willing to open in an area where that takes place, I think that we should look to give them tax incentives, because that bring employment, particularly if they hire locally.
Now let's switch to another barometer of poverty, the lack of affordable housing, which is a major problem in this borough. What programs do you have undergoing to alleviate this problem?
Well, one of the most important things we're doing around affordable housing, and the term affordable should be defined. Oftentimes people think affordable housing and they think low-income housing only, and that is not the reality. You could have a teacher and a police officer or an accountant and a clerk who are making $100,000 a year. They too are finding it difficult to live. And so when we think about affordable, we should do it in bands. We should include low income, we should include middle income, and to make sure we have that cross section of people that really makes a community a strong community. I am using something that's really unique here in the borough of Brooklyn. The last property owners, particularly those of color, the large volume are faith-based institutions. I have a Building by Faith initiative that I'm using my capital dollars to give to those churches who may have a parking lot next to their establishment that's going unused, or they may have air rights on top of their buildings. So we're using our capital dollars to incentivize them to build affordable housing or senior housing on their existing property. And then we are partnering with the mayor. We believe the mayor is moving in the right direction to ensure that any new development that takes place on city-owned property must include an affordable housing component with income bands to allow those who are looking for housing find housing. The big challenge we have is that many people understand that we have a large number of people that live in shelters. They understand the need of affordable housing, but there's a spirit of, yes, everywhere here, but not on my block. I don't want a building to be built higher. I don't want a new development on my block. I love my block. I love the trees and everything that comes with it. Yes, let's do more affordable housing, but we can't do it here. That's not the right attitude. That is not what we support. We need to ensure that we build the housing that is needed for the countless number of Brooklynites, and it must be affordable based on the circumstances.
A lot of people are leaving Brooklyn. What is your plan or strategy to slow down that exodus?
Well, I think that when you see the influx of people who could no longer afford to live in the borough of Brooklyn, and you say, how do we hold on to them? I only wish life was that simple. I would love for my son to return from college and move into Brooklyn. Brooklyn is affordable. We live in a city that's part of a country where an individual property owner can sell his or her property whatever the market can bear. That is our reality that we're up against. Those areas where we control the property, such as the city, then we can leverage that to make sure that we can retain those people who find the borough unaffordable. But the borough is unaffordable, unfortunately, because we're a victim of our success. The borough has become an attractive place to live. People are coming from all over the globe, all over the country to live in Brooklyn. And because of that, owners are really charging whatever they can get on their market. That's the system of real estate that we have. So I can't go to an individual property owner and say that, no, you can't charge this amount of rent. I own a 3-family house. When my tenants moved in 9 years ago, I had them sign a lease that as long as they're there, I would never raise their rent. And their rent has never gone up in those 9 years. That is because I know there's a lot for human need, there's just not a lot for human greed. But I'm not the typical landlord, and other landlords, we hope, will take the spirit. If you're an individual owner, we need to do more to help the burden of people. But we cannot force them to do it. We can only force those who want to change their zoning. And I utilize my ULA process to do that, to say if you want to change your zoning, you have to have affordable housing attached to it.
We have a presidential campaign going on right now. There's been a lot of talk about the middle class, the middle class, the middle class, but yet very little, if any, conversation about poverty and how to tackle poverty. Should they be talking about it, and why aren't they talking about it?
They should be talking about how important it is. You don't want to lose your middle class, and you don't want your middle class to slip into poverty. And those indicators, such as employment, such as the foreclosure rate, many of the middle class people have not recovered from the foreclosure crisis. How do we make people whole? And so when you look at the conversation of the middle class, we need to talk about how do we save the middle class, and how do we ensure that those who are living below the poverty line move into the middle class. It should be part of our conversation with a plan. How do we stop the hemorrhaging of jobs going overseas? How do we find creative ways of encouraging investments here at home? How do we deal with really repairing some of the credit that came from those middle class families that went through an awful time during the foreclosure crisis, and get them back to a level of stability?
No one is talking about how to get people from poverty into the middle class. Why isn't that being discussed?
I don't have the answer to why both candidates are not focusing more on poverty. They may not specifically talk about poverty, but there are those intangibles that they are in the lives of those who are in poverty and have stayed in poverty, that we need to address those intangibles. And I think some of the messages that are sent out quality education. Education has always been the key that unlocks the door to the middle class. Healthcare. It's difficult to focus on your lifestyle if you are not receiving the required amount of health care that you deserve. That's why Obama was right for having what has now been coined Obamacare, the right to health care. Employment, creating jobs, not allowing our jobs to go overseas. So how do you move people out of poverty into middle class? Is not a magic bullet or a switch. You look at all of those barriers that are preventing people from moving out of poverty and middle class. Lack of daycare. If a mother is trying to get daycare, but to have a job or sustain a job and is not available, it's difficult for her. Living in abusive families, the things we do around domestic violence or domestic abuse, all of these things contribute to the barriers that prevent people from going into a middle class lifestyle. You have to attack each one of those barriers. The question is the first to identify what's preventing the evolution into middle class, and then address each one of them. And it's not one size fit all. Each circumstance calls for a different adjustment to make a person move from where they are to where they ought to be.
When we come back, why some experts are saying that the federal government has dropped the ball on the real scope of poverty in the country. Thanks for staying tuned to our special Below the Poverty Line. The headlines have recently proclaimed that poverty is down in the U.S., but a closer look reveals that most of this growth has gone to the 1% of the country's wealthiest. There are still an estimated 43 million Americans who are barely making ends meet. This has led some to question the figures, while others hail them as a success. With me in studio to have a discussion about poverty statistics in New York and the country as a whole, a senior fellow from the Center for American Progress, Greg Kaufman, and the senior management consultant from the Robin Hood Foundation, Stephanie Phillips. Welcome.
Thanks,
Nice
Gary.
to be here.
So where are we? Are we poorer or richer? Stephanie?
So Robin Hood, which is the largest poverty fighting organization in New York City, supporting about 200 nonprofits in the city, recently published what we refer to as the Poverty Tracker Report with Columbia University. And what we've done is we've followed about 2,000 New York households over time. And surprisingly, our most recent report, which reveals about 3 years of data, shows that almost 73% of New Yorkers at some point in time experienced some important deprivation in their lives. Either they fell below the poverty line, they suffered from a severe material hardship, or they had a work-limiting health condition. And 73% is far higher a number than anybody had predicted.
And what are the reasons? Just stand on.
So I think the reasons are multiple. First, I think it's how we're counting. The official poverty statistics look only at income poverty, and they show about 20% of people being poor at any given point in time. We're looking at a more robust set of statistics. We're looking not only at what people's incomes are, but what really they're missing in their households on a month-to-month basis, whether they're running out of food, whether their utilities are getting shut off, whether they're facing eviction. And we're also looking at it over time versus just a snapshot. So I think when you combine all these pieces together, it's just a more robust, but frankly more troubling picture of how New Yorkers are living.
Why are we not talking more about poverty in the city or in the nation? I mean, we've been going through this presidential campaign, and frankly, despite what we've heard about people who are in dire straits, we're really not having a serious discussion about poverty and how it is affecting real people. Why is that, Greg?
Well, Gary, I think part of it, and part of the reason that the poverty tracker is an important tool, I think people are under the misimpression that poverty is like a fixed group of people, like who have just lost their initiative and are always poor. But really, what you're dealing with in poverty is a more universal experience. At the national level, nearly 40% of Americans will experience at least 1 year of poverty during their working years. And more than half will experience poverty or really close to it during the working years. So I think if people thought about more often how people fall in and out of poverty rather than thinking of it as this monolithic group, for example, the birth of a child can lead to poverty, an unexpected illness, job loss, or reduced hours. So it is baffling that we're not talking more about this, not only during the campaign, but with the media year in, year out.
Very good point, but there's also a stereotypical look at someone, poverty, as someone who was a loser, didn't do well in school, didn't really care much. There's nothing you can do about that.
I think that's what we're trying to do with the report here, is show that the percentage of people who remained in poverty from year to year was only around 9%, but many more people move in and out of poverty, and many, many more people, almost 60%, suffered poverty or suffered from hardship at some point in time. So regardless of how much money they were earning, they may be bringing in 2-3 times what would be considered the official poverty level, but because of the costs of their household, whether it's their housing costs or, as Greg said, an unexpected illness, they're still struggling to make ends meet. And that, that's everybody. That's all of our neighbors. That's not confined to a narrow group that we might stereotype.
And as public officials, policymakers, how do you begin to tackle the issues? Do you segment them? You take one area at a time, or do you have sort of like this grand master plan on how to dealing with it?
Well, I mean, just looking at the sort of national policy at the federal level, there's so much we could be doing. Let's start with the minimum wage. You know what? If you pay people poverty wages, they're going to stay in poverty, all right? So like in the late 1960s, Gary, the minimum wage was sufficient. So if I worked full time, I could lift a family of 3 out of poverty. Why is it like not that way today? You work full time today as a minimum wage worker, that family of 3 is more than $5,000 below the poverty line. Mm-hmm. Another example, access to paid leave. Why can't every other industrialized country has access to paid sick and family leave? Why here, if my kid's sick at home and I have to take care of him or her, I miss a paycheck? There are people who literally miss one paycheck and end up homeless. Another thing, childcare. Tough to go to work if you don't have affordable childcare, safe place for your kids. Right now in this country, 1 year of infant care in a childcare facility costs more than the average tuition at a public university. So there are some really obvious things that I think most Americans would agree we should be doing. That's just an example of some of the sort of what I would call more low-hanging fruit.
Okay. Stephanie?
I mean, I think we've made great strides in this country recently already. What we've heard a lot about in the campaign from one of the candidates is the CHIP program, which is the child health insurance that covers all children in New York State. Things like that make a huge difference. But the Affordable Care Act also brought many more.
You almost said Obamacare. Huh?
I almost did, and then I caught myself. But thanks for pointing that out. And I think both are now equally non-pejorative. The Affordable Care Act brought many more people into health care coverage because, as Greg correctly pointed out, a health crisis or even an illness, an unexpected illness, when you're uninsured, can devastate a household's finances. And one of the things that we looked at in the most recent poverty tracker was how what we refer to as shocks, an unexpected illness, an incidence of crime, a loss of job, or a change in wages or a change in hours can really throw a household into poverty and or hardship. And so there's a really close correlation between these shocks and poverty, states of poverty and hardship. And we're still trying to tease out which causes which, but it's clear that they're critical to how households are faring here. And so, Greg points out a lot of really important potential government programs that could address this. But right now what we're seeing is that a crisis really changes the trajectory of a household over time.
Sure. Let's talk about this whole anti-poverty movement, okay, because that's really important. Where are we in terms of policy and having a sustained way to fight that?
Yeah. Well, one thing I would point out that we are doing right, we hear all the time, from President Reagan, we waged a war on poverty and poverty won. Well, the fact is that our safety net today, without it, poverty would be twice as high in this country. Mm-hmm. So think about a country with nearly 30% poverty. So there's a lot we're doing right. Earned income tax credit, child tax credit combined lifted nearly 10 million people out of poverty last year. Social Security, more than 20 million people out of poverty. Food stamps or SNAP, more than 5 million a year. So there are a lot of things we're doing right. But we need to talk about them more, both our policymakers, our activists, and the media about what we're doing right and how we can do better. And I do think you alluded to an anti-poverty movement. I consider Black Lives Matter, Fight for 15, groups like these, the Dreamers with immigration reform. We need to create that groundswell of support for anti-poverty policy, because nothing really changes dramatically in this country without a movement.
One last question before we wrap this up, Greg. It seems like we're in a collision course. The wages are being depressed while the prices of housing are rising. So now, what happens to the workers who need to keep this city afloat?
Right. Well, I mean, I think if there is any good news, and it's hard to use that phrase with this, I do think that the interests of a lot of middle-income people and people with lower incomes, working class, they really are converging when it comes. Look, 50% of people in this country can't come up with, I can't remember if it's $300 or $400.
$400.
Yeah, should they face an emergency? So like a lot of these issues, whether it's housing, food prices, access to health care, savings, cost of education. We all need access to education to do well in this economy. It's not just a problem for people who live in poverty. It's a problem for people who might not live in poverty now, but will find themselves in poverty for that 1 year during their working years. So I think our interests are converging.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thanks to my guest, Greg Kaufman, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, and Senior Management Consultant from the Robin Hood Foundation, Stephanie Phillips. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Finally from us, our On the Shelf segment. This week, Abi Ishola speaks with Dr. Nicole Mason about her new book, Born Bright. The book examines poverty in the U.S. to Dr. Mason's own experiences.
Welcome, Nicole. So your book, it's about how you grew up poor, but it's also about poverty in this country. Can you talk about why you were inspired to write this book?
I wanted to write this book for a couple of reasons. First, the main reason was to really tell a different story about poverty in America, one that I don't think we get to see in the popular imagination or even in the dominant media or in culture. And I really wanted to give voice to not only my experience growing up, but the experience of so many kids and families growing up in America that, again, we don't get to hear those stories.
So there's this idea of the American dream that's usually sold to poor people, immigrants. Do you feel that the American dream is real?
If we are defining the American dream as a solid job, middle-class income, home ownership, comfortable retirement, making it healthy, kids and family, if that's how we're defining the American dream, I think for a lot of poor people, 47 million to be exact, getting to that idea is almost impossible for them to get to.
Yeah, because you talk a lot about the American dream in your book, which I found fascinating, because I feel like you dissected it to a degree.
Well, I really wanted for us to ask ourselves, are we really being honest? When we say that it doesn't matter where you start, if you work hard enough, or you are grit, or you're resilient, you'll make it to the middle class. And I think it's a lie. And I think we need to really be honest about what it really takes to get to the middle class or to achieve the American dream. And for many people, it's out of reach.
Why do you think it's a lie?
Because we all know that only a small portion of people who start out poor ever make it to the middle class. I think it's around 20%. And when we talk about making it to the 1% or to the 20th, the upper echelons, it's less than 4%. So to tell people, particularly low-income kids and families, that if they work hard enough, and they'll make it, it makes it seem like if they don't make it, it's something wrong with them, or that they didn't do the work, and that's simply not true.
A part of your book that I found really interesting, you were in a room, you were giving a talk to a room full of policymakers and politicians, and at one point you said that you felt the system was broken, and that's why poverty is an issue. So you then kind of went off script of what you usually say, correct?
Yes.
And you saw that people were disagreeing with what you were saying. And you said at that moment you had to take off the mask of the middle class that you had created. What exactly is that mask? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think when I am in these spaces, these policy spaces or these conferences, it's assumed that I'm like everyone else, that I'm a policymaker, I have a Ph.D., I have these, 2 children who are in high-performing schools, and so it's assumed that I have the same kind of background and advantages that all the people I'm assuming in the room have enjoyed. And so I had not, up until that point, talked about my own history and background. And it was triggered. I felt compelled to say something because the people in the room were standing up and blaming the individuals for their circumstances instead of really looking at what was happening, what goes on in communities that really prevent people from reaching full economic security. And so I had a mix of emotions, from anger to, I have to make this intervention, and if I don't do it now, when will I do it?
I want to read
a chance to do it.
I want to read part of the book that I loved. You said, I had firsthand knowledge of the messiness of poverty and the feelings the poor internalize from birth, like the belief that our very existence is a burden on society. So do you think there's this thing of blaming poor people for some sort of, issue in the country, or you said a burden in society?
Well, I think so. I think absolutely. And we see it now, even in the presidential rhetoric. So Donald Trump, for example, is this guy who made it without assistance. He's really he's a hard worker. I'm putting hard worker here. And we don't see that he had the best advantages, and he went to great schools all along the way. And so, and then in the same breath, when you talk about poor people, it's this idea that I don't know why they can't do it. If you have schools, if you have get up and go, you'll be as successful. And we just know that that's not true. And I really wanted to disrupt that narrative and really call out not only conservatives, but also liberals who I think all really secretly believe the same thing about poor people. It's embedded in all of our policies, whether it's welfare reform or some of these other punitive policies that are coming out. At the core of them is this belief about poor people as a burden on society.
The title of your book is Born Bright. Why that title?
Well, I really wanted to drive home the message that we are all born bright. We're all born with the same potential for greatness, and want the best for ourselves and for our families and our communities. But because of these other things, whether they be structural or institutional, our lights are dampened and we are not able to step into our full potential and really try to grapple with why that is.
Dr. Mason, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
Born Bright is now available online and in bookstores. That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.